A year ago, Keir Starmer swept into Downing Street promising to fix the UK's economy. On the world stage, the UK Prime Minister held a Ukraine summit, rebuilt EU ties and strengthened relations with President Donald Trump. But he faces pressure at home amid slow economic growth and rising illegal migration. So, how successful has Starmer been in his first year? Hello and welcome to Roundtable. I'm Enda Brady. Now, 12 months ago, UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer promised to put more money in people's pockets, rescue the National Health Service and get Britain building homes again. Since then, his government has made progress. More homes have been built and the NHS has seen millions more in funding. But after delivering a budget that raised taxes, many Britons say they are feeling the squeeze. So, has Starmer kept his promises? Or is public confidence starting to slip?
It was one of the biggest Labour wins in modern UK history.
Thank you, thank you. Thank you so much for that reception. What an amazing reception. We did it!
Starmer came in promising stability and change. But it's been a tough first year. Before he even took office, the UK was facing multiple crises. A cost of living crisis, overburdened public services, war in Europe, and economic uncertainty. His biggest challenge so far, a welfare reform U-turn due to a rebellion in his party, where MPs said the cuts are unfair and go against what the party stands for. In response, Starmer made concession to the bill. The bill went through by 75 votes.
The reformed welfare system that we're putting in place will be better for individuals, better for the taxpayer and better for the economy.
Starmer also promised to fix the NHS. A new plan now offers quicker tests and same-day checkups. Hospitals are getting more money, but doctors say staff shortages are still a problem. On housing, Labour says it's making progress with more homes built. But abroad the picture is different. Starmer is building strong ties with world leaders, including Donald Trump.
We're very long-time partners and allies and friends, and we've become friends in a short period of time. He's slightly more liberal than I am.
Has also boosted Britain's defence spending, committed to NATO targets, and signed a historic military deal with Ukraine.
Thank you, dear Prime Minister, dear Keir, thank you for invitation. And we are very thankful to UK, all your team and people of the United Kingdom for such big support of Ukraine from the very beginning of this war.
Starmer has also strengthened ties with the EU, holding summits with European leaders to restore trust post-Brexit. 1 year in, Starmer's foreign policy looks confident. But still welfare cuts and slow economic growth are raising doubts. The honeymoon is for sure over. Now comes the hard part, delivering on the promise of real change.
Well, let's meet our guests. Here with me in the studio, we have Russell Foster. He's Senior Lecturer in British and International Politics at King's College. And Nina de Roy dos Santos, a journalist, broadcaster and host of the podcast Control, Alt, Deceit. Also joining us from Glasgow, we have Sir John Curtice, Professor of Politics at the University of Strathclyde. And in Berlin, we have John Kampfner, who's the author and foreign affairs analyst. You're all very welcome to this roundtable. Sir John, I read an interview with you this week in the newspapers in the UK where you said this was the worst start any Prime Minister had ever had. Were you forgetting the glory hours of Liz Truss?
No, because I was referring very specifically to the electoral record of newly elected governments. So that is when a government wins an election for the first time and power is transferred. Actually, this government started off with the lowest share of the vote ever won by a majority government, 35%. So despite that landslide at Westminster, in terms of votes, Labour's performance last year was not particularly impressive, but they're now running on average in the opinion polls at 24%. That's 11 points down on that relatively low figure of last year. And no previous government a year into office has been suffering that kind of loss. It's been a gradual process. It began to be evident in September of October of last year. It's not tied to any particular event like Liz Truss's fiscal event. It's been a gradual process, which got down to about 24% last month and now seems to have plateaued at around that figure.
John Kampfner, to you, how has Starmer then squandered all of this political capital so quickly?
Well, seen from where I am, it is quite remarkable because the British electoral system tries to ensure, it doesn't always do so, but it tries to ensure not just working majorities, but in several recent occasions, large majorities. Whether that's justified by the popular vote, as was certainly not the case with Keir Starmer, is another thing. But he has this huge, great majority. He has the main opposition party, or at least it was the main opposition party when he won a year ago, in absolutely disarray. And yet, as John Curtice has pointed out, has performed so listlessly in this year. And if you think of German politicians and their constitution, they have to form coalitions, and they have to negotiate for months very hard on coalitions and then just get through whatever it is they get through. They would die for the kinds of political power that in theory Starmer had at his disposal. And I think it points to a much wider problem, which is a problem that we're seeing all over Europe and in many countries around the world, which is what do liberal mainstream governments stand for, and how do they get anything through if they don't know what they want?
Thanks, John. Nina, to you, Keir Starmer will no doubt say that he was given a hospital pass of a country left in a complete mess after 14 years of Conservative rule. That will be his reasoning.
And that was his reasoning when, of course, he and Rachel Reeves came out with their initial budget that was quite punitive to your average Briton. Large tax rises. She made the point that she didn't want to have to do this. Indeed, she went on the record, the Chancellor, saying she would hope that she would never have to come out with such draconian measures in the future. And now it seems as though the economy is still stalling. None of that has worked. And the British people are preparing themselves for yet more tax rises come the autumn when there's the next reason to, look at the figures and start raising taxes again. All of this will continue to sour the popularity of this government, as you just said, 1 year into office. And it fundamentally doesn't solve the main problem that he inherited. Yes, but perhaps he has played badly as a hand, and that is there just isn't enough money to do what the government says they want to do and wanted to do on their manifesto, and there isn't enough money to do what people want them to do either. So the big question here is, as you just heard from John there, there are traditionally very stable governments in the UK, ones that are longer than one mandate. Will this end up being a one-mandate Labour government? Because they came into office assuming probably that there'd be two.
Russell, he's not the greatest of communicators, let's face it, but in terms of the message that the British public is receiving from Keir Starmer, do people even know what he stands for?
It's very difficult to say, in all honesty, what Starmer stands for. Now, we have to put into context that Starmer did inherit a broken country. He also inherited a broken Labour Party, and he came to power in an era quite unlike previous prime ministers going back into the 20th century, defined by two problems. One is a severe set of international crises, which he can't control and can only respond to, and which need a lot of money. Second, he's come to power with a huge majority in a country where tens of millions of people have lost faith in the political system and in professional politicians. Now, in 2024, after a series of prime ministers who promised the earth that wonderful phrase, jam tomorrow. They promised everything and delivered very nothing. In 2024, there was a real appetite for a dull, plodding, frankly boring administrator who would be able to get on with the day job. But the problem is that in our society, we don't necessarily want a dull, plodding person who brings in small incremental changes. We want a bit of political theatre, and unfortunately, we don't get that in Starmer's communications.
Thanks, Russell. Sir John, talking of political theatre, Nigel Farage is polling very, very high at the moment. His Reform Party are effectively the next opposition, possibly even the next Prime Minister. How big a problem is that for Starmer now, the popularity of Farage creeping up?
Well, it's a problem for both Labour and the Conservatives, but it's a different kind of problem for the two parties. So far as Labour is concerned, reform at 15%, which is what they were at back in last year's general election, was wonderful news, because one of the crucial reasons why Labour got the very substantial majority they got was that reform took away around a quarter of the people who had voted Conservative in 2019. That depressed the Conservative vote in many a Conservative-held constituency, and that enabled Labour, on the back of what was very little advance in their own popularity, to pick up a Conservative seat after Conservative seat. The problem now for him is that with Reform running at 29%, it's not Reform who would pick up those seats that the Conservatives won in 2019, but actually often it will be Reform themselves. The problem for the Conservatives, however, is that it's Reform above all who are taking their votes. The Reform are very much occupying a very niche market in British politics, although it's a quite substantial one. It's perhaps best illustrated by the fact that Reform are now running at 50% amongst those people who voted in favour of leaving the European Union back in 2016. These are the people who are they're in favour of Brexit, they're concerned about immigration, they're not very keen on equalities policies, all the kind of culture wars issues. They take a Conservative stance. Now, Labour are losing some votes to Reform, but actually they're losing rather more votes to the Liberal Democrats and to the Greens. But it's because Reform are now eating further, deeply into traditional Conservative support that Reform now have this polling lead over Labour of around 5 percentage points.
Thanks, Sir John. John Kampfner in Berlin. Let's look at the European picture then for Starmer. He has reached out to the Chancellor of Germany. He's on a very good working relationship with Macron in France. We've seen him visit Albania, work with Giorgia Meloni in Italy. He's doing his utmost to build bridges where previous prime ministers had burned them in Europe, quite frankly.
And that's appreciated. They absolutely see a different type of Britain. They can also read the newspapers, read social media, and see the difficulties Keir Starmer is facing. Are frustrated at the same time that he takes, as ever, tiny incremental steps in terms of any form of rapprochement with the European Union. But something is better than nothing, they would argue. And the most important aspect of all of this, and the one that they particularly appreciate, the new German Chancellor, Friedrich Merz, who's made an absolute beeline for Starmer, and very shortly, in a matter of weeks, a new bilateral friendship agreement is going to be signed between the two countries. And Merz and Macron see Starmer not only as, in security and defence terms, as a very solid British Prime Minister, but also as a very useful conduit to the extremely unpredictable and dangerous Donald Trump.
And John, do you think Starmer is actively trying to push the UK closer to the European Union? Because many, many people have Brexit regret now, those who did vote for it.
No, I don't. I mean, I would love it if he did. And most people like me would love it if he did. And pretty much everybody in Europe, apart from Viktor Orban in Hungary, would love it if he did. But it's not going to happen, sadly. Starmer, as with all aspects of public policy that's already been mentioned, spends most of his time looking over his shoulder at Nigel Farage and Reform. He should be looking elsewhere, as John Curtice said, towards genuine liberal left voters who are fed up with so much aspect of populism. But instead, Starmer has allowed himself, in my view, to be defined by the Farage threat. You see that not only in his fear of really substantial change towards Europe, but you see that in the language that he's used about immigration, although he has recently apologized for that. And Starmer has definitely picked out the man he thinks is the threat. But the problem always is there's no point in trying to emulate a far-right leader. You might as well leave them to do their politics and you get on to do yours in a more sensible way.
Thanks, John. Nina, let's look at the relationship he has built with President Trump of the United States. This was always going to be tricky. I think whatever critics may say about Starmer, he has played a blinder here with Trump, hasn't he?
Well, the bromance between Keir Starmer and Donald Trump has been one of the big surprises here, hasn't it? Because they couldn't be more different characters. Donald Trump, of course, is big, he's bombastic, he's flashy. Keir Starmer is anything but the sort. And also he comes from more humble beginnings than the US president. But having said that, he's realised very early on that the best way to Donald Trump's heart, it seems, is to first flatter the ego and then afterwards start to try and negotiate softly, softly. And that's exactly what he did with his visit to the White House when he, you'll remember with that famous flourish, handed him a letter inviting him personally, the US president, to another audience, another state visit with the King. And that worked really well. In fact, the UK became the first country to have its first trade deal negotiated with the United States, despite the fact that so many people were concerned that may well never happen. That said, there is a certain hollowness to this relationship and the special relationship. It doesn't look good for the future, considering as obviously the United States failed to warn the UK properly when it decided to strike those nuclear facilities in Iran. And that just goes to show that despite the warming relations, they only go so far.
Russell, come in on the Trump relationship, because he chops and changes President Trump, he flips and flops. And yet Starmer has been praised by him, and you couldn't pick two more politically different people.
I've never met either Donald Trump or Keir Starmer, but I think it's fair to say that they don't particularly have an affection for one another. This is a very tactical relationship. Starmer is playing the long game. He is not responsible for what happens in the White House, in the United States voting system. Starmer, like Mark Rutte, the head of NATO, like Emmanuel Macron, like most Western leaders, knows that the United States can no longer be relied upon as a partner for defence. Regardless of what happens to Donald Trump, if he's abducted by aliens tomorrow, we'll have President Vance. If he goes, there's likely to be another MAGA-style president. Leaders like Starmer, Macron, Rutte, they know that they need to buy time. This is a little bit like Neville Chamberlain in the late 1930s. It's not about appeasing a lunatic. It's about knowing what's coming further down the line in a few years' time. He has to flatter Trump until our munitions factories are online, until our military recruitment numbers have gone up. So I think that Starmer is biting his lip and pretending to be nice to Trump.
Do you really think he's thinking that far ahead?
I think he is. Remember that in 2024, Starmer campaigned for a 10-year Labour government, and a major part of that was rebuilding defence. Starmer has had some very significant wobbles on domestic policy. We can't deny that. But nobody thought he would play such a good role internationally in support for our allies in Ukraine, in support for NATO, and in planning for Britain's medium to longer term future in a world of challenges where we can't rely on Uncle Sam.
Sir John, to you, how does Starmer avoid becoming a one-term Prime Minister then, if the ambition is to serve 10 years in number 10 Downing Street?
Well, there are three things ultimately he needs to do. The first is to achieve the economic growth that the Labour Party promised in the election in July last year, but which so far has been more notable by its absence than by its presence. Secondly, he needs to turn around the health service, which inherited record waiting lists. They've made some progress in reducing that, but that is also a very difficult task, particularly because British society, like so many societies, is currently aging. But then three, and above all, he's got to become a politician, much more of a politician and less of a lawyer. One of his signal things is that he doesn't do narrative. He's not created a story about what this government is about. He's not given a vision of the kind of Britain he would like to create and leave in 10 years' time. I think ultimately people do not know where Keir Starmer is trying to get this country. And until they have that clear, it's not entirely sure how easily Labour will find it to get their lost voters back.
John, in Berlin, that's a very, very good point, isn't it? That there is a comms problem at the heart of the Starmer project.
There's more than a comms problem. I think, as John Curtice was saying, there's a strategic problem. There's a desire problem. There's the sense of it's not a question of communicating better at what it is you want to do. It's knowing what it is that you want to do. The problem that all mainstream politicians face, particularly mainstream politicians on the centre-left, is that you can't simply respond and you can't keep on saying, oh, things are complicated. We can just tweak a little bit here and press a little button there. If you look at the populists, they say, actually, life is simple. These are the goodies, these are the baddies, these are enemies, this is what I want to do, this is what I'm going to do. And that, in our present age, is a lot more sexy, it's a lot more attractive. And somehow, mainstream politics has to, and Keir Starmer absolutely personifies that. I mean, for goodness sake, if you can't engineer radical change to your country with an enormous majority, then when can you?
Thank you, John. Nina, just come in on that point about communication. If you think back to Tony Blair as a Labour Prime Minister, 11 years in number 10, everybody got the message, whether they liked it or not. Everybody knew what Blair wanted to do. And Starmer just doesn't have that kind of ability.
And I remember that election because it was the first time that somebody like me came of age to vote. So it really, really energised my age group. I was about to go to university. And I distinctly remember that was a time when you got some signalling about what a new incoming Labour government could mean about 6 months before there was even an election. Now, to give Keir Starmer some credit and his team, this election in 2024 was called about 6 months earlier than even the ruling Conservative Party was expecting at that point. So even the ruling party's MPs were wrong-footed by that. That was obviously designed to try and, take the steam out of Labour's wins. But essentially what it meant was that Labour won by default. So, as you just heard there from Sir John Curtice, that yes, they won the lion's share of seats, a landslide, but it was a hollow victory because the vote share wasn't significant at all. And they didn't have to come up with any real, really difficult policies that they then had to road test. What that essentially meant was that when eventually they did take some difficult decisions, they didn't necessarily have the homework to back it up with. And then we had U-turn after U-turn after U-turn. And going into this 2024 election, many people continually said, I don't know what Keir Starmer stands for. We're now 1 year after a government of Keir Starmer, and still people are complaining they don't know what Keir Starmer stands for. Indeed, some people also say that perhaps the government hasn't realised that it is now in government.
Russell, to you, for all the critique of Starmer, he does strike me as a fundamentally very decent man who cares about the country.
I think this is a very fair assessment. Starmer has not done everything right. Show me a politician or a human being who gets everything right the first time around. And let's give Starmer some credit for what he did to the Labour Party. He inherited a Labour Party on the eve of the pandemic, which had achieved its lowest result since the 1930s. Under Jeremy Corbyn, Labour was doing worse than it had done since the Great Depression. Keir Starmer turned that around within 4 years, 4 years, to result in this enormous majority,
landslide.
One of the largest, an enormous landslide. Yes, he's a bit of a dull communicator, but Starmer inherited a very toxic and badly divided Labour Party. He has come to power in an era when people's trust in politicians and political systems is at an all-time low, in an era of global instability, hyperinflation, cost of living, all of these problems. And these are problems that Tony Blair didn't have. And unlike Tony Blair, Keir Starmer has placed himself in the centre, which means it's never good to be in the centre because you're attacked from both sides. But he's now fighting a five-front war against the hard left, the Greens, the Liberal Democrats, Reform, and don't write off the Conservatives. Right now, they're not doing well, but they haven't survived for 200 years by being fools. It's possible that they will make a comeback. So, to give Starmer credit, he has put the country ahead of the party and himself, and I think he's doing better than we give him credit for.
Thanks, Russell. Sir John, final point to you. That's a very interesting point. He has put the country ahead of the party, and that is to his credit.
I think I put it slightly differently. I think what Keir Starmer did was to position his party so that when the Conservatives messed up big time, as they did, one over Partygate and two over the Liz Truss fiscal event, the Labour Party were at least sufficiently acceptable to pick up some of the support that the Conservatives lost. But frankly, during the whole of that period, basically Labour's principal objective as a very uncertain party, a party that wasn't confident of victory, was to do the least that was required in order to win. That came at the price of thinking about the messages that you might want to convey so that you could govern effectively. And in some senses, I think what we've seen in the last 12 months are the consequences of the strategy of Starmer in opposition. It did not position this government in a good place for when it actually came in government. And the weaknesses of Starmer as a communicator that we've been talking about, the lack of a broad sense of direction, those are all seeds that were sown by Starmer's Labour Party, albeit, yes, Russell is right, he turned his party around, but did no more than basically accepted an acceptable vehicle of protest.
We'll end with a prediction from John Kampfner in Berlin. John, is he just keeping the seat warm for Nigel Farage in 2029?
I would have said previously, absolutely not. What I find sometimes sticks in the craw is that when we had the recent German elections, there was a lot of British coverage was, oh, look at the far right, they're about to take over here and stuff, which was not going to happen and isn't going to happen by dint of the electoral system. And Brits have an ability or a failure to not look slightly more at themselves, more critically at themselves. And so therefore, a short answer to your question is I would put a little bit more money on reform, forming some kind of government next time round, than a far-right government in Germany.
Thank you, John in Berlin, and Sir John Curtice as well. Russell and Nina here in the studio with me. Remember, you can see more discussion and debate on our YouTube channel. Just search for Roundtable TRT World. But for now, from me, Enda Brady, and all the team here, goodbye and thank you for watching.